Welcome to Heritage Matters webinar number 4, Accelerating the Transition to Sustainability, What Policy Solutions for Climate Emergency. You would have all read while registering that, we do take the position that COVID-19 is related to emergencies of environmental degradation and climate change. And the present lockdown and the crisis that we have has actually reduced pollution, improved air quality, and of course the World Environment Day starts tomorrow. This is the eve of World Environment Day, so we thought we'll go one day before. So we got a wonderful set of panelists, list of panelists, if you will. I shouldn't call them set like a mathematical equation. And we have, I'll introduce them and then one by one, they will speak for about up to 6 to 8 minutes. And you would have all Googled them. So we won't go into detailed introductions, take up your time. First, we have Mrs. Naz Rizvi, Director, National Museum of Natural History of India, Ministry of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change from New Delhi. Mrs. Rizvi, welcome. Thank you for making the time. I know even during the lockdown, you're all over India with emergencies. Then we have Dr. Miniya Chatterji, CEO Sustainable Labs Paris. She's an author, columnist, adjunct professor, Sciences Po Paris, and director, Ananta Center for Sustainability at Anant National University. We both are at the same university, but she's in wonderful Goa while I'm in hot and humid Ahmedabad. Then there's Professor Dr. Rohit Jigyasu from Rome, project manager in urban heritage, climate change, and disaster risk management, International Center for Conservation and Restoration in Rome. He's also vice president of International Council of Monuments and Sites International, Paris, and he was formerly UNESCO chairholder in Kyoto. Then we have Douglas Worts. Doug and I are probably the older generation here. Everybody else is much younger than us. Doug is with the International Coalition for Climate Justice. He's a culture and sustainability specialist. And he's based in Toronto. He's also with the Sustainability Committee of American Association of State and Local History Museums. And my name is Amareswar Galla. I'm at Anant National University. I'm your host. And hope you all can hear us clearly. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Mrs. Naz Rizvi. Mrs. Rizvi, what does the World Environment Day, the whole climate change, accelerating policy position on climate emergencies, what does it all mean to you as a director of the peak body, the peak museum of natural history for India? Could you please kickstart the discussion?
Thank you, Dr. Galla. Namaskar and heartiest greeting to all of you. Like you said, what does it mean to me as a director, National Museum of Natural History? Let me it is my pleasure to tell you all that we will be celebrating our 42nd anniversary of this museum, which was opened to public on 5th June 1978 itself. And we have expanded our outreach and geographical coverage by establishing 4 regional centers, and a 5th one is under establishment. Let me clarify in the beginning itself that I am no expert on this topic, but would love to take this opportunity given by Dr. Galla to express my views and enrich my knowledge by hearing other panelists. As we all know that over the past few decades, there have been a growing concern about the social and environmental risk which have come along with the progress achieved through a variety of mutually intertwined modernization process. In recent years, these concerns are transformed into a widely shared sense of urgency, partly due to the events such as various pandemic threatening human beings, livestock, and increasing awareness on the crisis and realities of climate change. The sense of urgency includes an awareness that our entire climate change is an emergency and that threatens the growth and sustainable development prospects of each sector and community. The threat is especially acute in and to developing countries. The changing climate is already altering the ecological and social systems that underpin human well-being and economic activities. The risks are greater to the world's poorest and most vulnerable people who are the central focus of sustainable development efforts and are already being forced to confront and adopt the adverse impact of climate change. The impact of climate change that are felt and seen today are geographically varied, unpredictable, and exponential, and they are projected to worsen depending upon the efficacy of climate action. The way in which communities, cities, and countries are developing ultimately determines both their vulnerability to climate change and their exposure to its impact, which multiply and compound upon one another, particularly in places where poverty and disadvantage are widespread and existing development is limited. The escalating climate crisis is a huge obstacle to reducing poverty, and I quote from the report of IPCC of the year 2018 that natural disasters alone are pushing 26 million people a year into poverty, and climate change is expected to increase the frequency and severity of such disasters. So without sound climate-informed development, climate change could force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. And this is again from the report of IPCC of year 2018. I fear that this data may escalate dramatically, keeping in mind the COVID-19 scenario globally these days. Climate change also adds to the challenges arising from rapid population growth and urbanization, and in many developing countries, placing further pressure on already limited resources and systems, and especially on land and water. Nearly all countries are committed to implementing the Paris Agreement, yet further commitments and actions are needed to plan, finance, deliver, and maintain the transformative changes and the agreement call for. Keeping all this in mind, let's ponder on the thought that is COVID-19 a dress rehearsal for the climate emergency? Are there any lessons to be found in humanity response to COVID-19 that can help us to fight climate change also? The question many of us are asking these days is, how do we deal with the new public health crisis while also trying to respond to the climate emergencies as well as the bubbling crisis of biodiversity loss and inequality? But I wonder if this is the right question. Perhaps a better question is what we can learn from the response, what we can learn from the responses to COVID-19 that might allow us to be better equipped to address critical sustainability challenges. As professional from museum fraternity, other important question is, can museum act as perfect climate change education tool? I feel personally that museum must come out of their comfort zone of the purpose they are made for, like whether it is a natural history museum or an art museum or I mean its objective and names can be anything and can play a very pivotal role in creating awareness and sensitizing people from all walks of life across the globe on these issues. Museums and science centers hold a very unique position in media and political landscape as trusted information sources and are emerging as and can emerge and in some countries are also emerging as a key player in climate change debates. The big task I think sector should take is not only to inform public on the science of climate change, but also help equip citizens with tactical knowledge that entire participation in action and debate on climate change that affects their future. So with these words, I would like to hear other panelists.
Thank you, Mrs. Rizvi. I think you hit the nail on the head that, people keep saying that climate change is borderless, global north, global south, everybody's affected. However, there's such gross inequities in the world. The impacts are quite diverse, quite debilitating and devastating for so many people below the poverty line and also living in vulnerable areas of the world to climate change. Now, we'll move over to Dr. Miniya Chatterji. Miniya, over to you.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Amar. So my work and my writings, have mostly they focus on the economically disadvantaged and the more vulnerable groups. And my company, Sustain Labs, what we try to do is leverage the private sector to incentivize social good. I'm not a big fan of CSR. It might be controversial, but I do think that you need to put in structures within the private sector so that they are, inherently capable of being responsible socially as well as being responsible to the environment. From that perspective, the concern about the current disaster, and as Mrs. Rizvi, she currently pointed out, as how in its connections to the kind of disaster that we could foresee related to climate change, would again be more focused to the vulnerable groups. There, one of the things, I'll just point out a few things within that. Is that number one, empty stomachs cannot be thinking about the planet, and they probably should not be thinking about the planet too. You need to first, feed yourself, have a shelter over your head, and that has immense policy implications for the government. That how do you come up with solutions for disasters, be it a health disaster like the current one, or a natural disaster that not only looks at, in this case, the virus, or in climate change, looking at the environment, but also making sure that in a country like ours, it's also catering to food security and shelter for all. So that's my first premise. The second is that for the poor, for those who, have to think about the food at home, for the night, for them, COVID or the climate, a flood that comes in the consequence of climate change, that's actually a crisis within a crisis. So again, since you asked us to look at the policy solutions, it's, governments like India, they need to think very differently than a government, let's say, in Europe, whose population do not have to, the major part of the population do not have to be going through a crisis within a crisis when there is a consequence of, climate change induced or a disaster such as the current one. The third aspect would be that, both COVID, a health disaster like COVID, as well as some of the, floods and other such consequences of climate change that have occurred, have repeatedly pointed out that there is no disaster management protocol in place. And sadly, the biggest consequence of that is again on the vulnerable population. It's their kacha houses which break the first. The labor community in India, which has been much written about, one of the main reasons of their exodus was that their shelters in the cities were temporary. They were not sufficient. They didn't feel secure in terms of food and shelter in the cities. And yet, we still don't have a protocol in place. So that is and that impacts the disadvantaged groups the most. Now, if we think about from this perspective, now if we move on to solutions, that's something that I've given it immense amount of thought, and I'm kind of trying to practice that and put a few things into action. So I would look at working the solutions, whether it is for a pandemic or whether it is a disaster caused by due to natural factors, as a partnership between, yes, policy, like your brief for today evening pointed out, but also with the private sector and universities and museums, like Mrs. Rizvi pointed out. So the government, it can do, it has the benefit of scale and implementation. That's where they come in, as well as things like stimulus packages, which the government has recently announced in India, but they don't go that far if you don't solve the problem. So the government, I think their biggest tool is to scale and to implement. The private sector, I think private sector in these kind of scenarios, they have the ability to reach out to a lot of people by just their stakeholders, their employees, their customers, the communities, the rural and urban communities that they're connected with. So they can really leverage that. And also we should not just depend on the government for funding. The private sector can contribute as well. For climate change, only 6% of the funds that come in for climate change are public. So most of the amount that comes in is public funds, that's taxpayers' money. And we really need to mobilize private money to come in for climate change solutions. And the last, actor in this threefold partnership are universities and museums. I think it is our job, it is our role to come up with innovative ideas and solutions to leverage students and professors and researchers, and all the creativity towards coming up with unbiased solutions which are not craving for profits, nor are they craving for votes. And the thing is that we need to know how to work this partnership, whether it is for climate change or whether it is for the pandemic.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miniya. I think that this whole leveraging the partnerships, building relationships, as you pointed out, a crisis within a crisis. Our next panelist, Professor Jigyasu, Rohit Jigyasu, is one of the world's leading authorities on disaster preparedness and disaster response. But I think the COVID-19 is a new challenge that he and his team and his colleagues face. So over to Professor Jigyasu.
Thank you very much, Amar. It's my privilege to be having an opportunity to speak at the platform that you provide now. So, okay, so let me start by this. First question. We should look at the underlying cause of this crisis that we are facing today. Yes, the virus has created havoc around the world, and we can look for immediate faults, right? We are looking for faults, but it is time for us to do a little deeper introspection. Of course, this disaster is caused by a biological hazard, but it is not natural. Rather, it is human induced. And I think this is the first thing I would like to make here. On one hand, we are now facing the brunt of climate change, which is altering the environment and behavior of all living beings. On the other hand, rapid and rather haphazard urbanization has destroyed ecosystems to an unimaginable extent. So while our lopsided development models have forced people to flock to cities, and many of them live in deplorable conditions, stuck together in highly densified areas, those poor and marginalized in the cities. So I think this unholy combination of climate change and urbanization has in fact catalyzed and magnified this COVID-19 pandemic. So this is something which we have to understand. They are not separate, they are all interconnected. And when we say that COVID-19 pandemic is just something that we have to be considering as a biological hazard, I think we are missing the point. Now, let us discuss how heritage figures in this discussion. Now, if we observe and rediscover the knowledge systems that are embedded in our heritage, we will learn about countless examples of human coexistence with its local environment, creating unique cultures that have sensitively responded to given conditions while also benefiting from them, whether in terms of architecture, objects of daily use, or intangible practices. There are many inspiring examples to show how intangible heritage has actually been an effective way of managing people's relationship to the environment, limiting the growth of settlements to an optimum level. Heritage is not just buildings, heritage is not just brick and mortar. What we actually miss is the point that heritage is actually a result of a very close interlinkage of humans with their environment, and that interrelationship is what created that conditions for us to survive for so many centuries. Now, of course, we cannot look at this interrelationship in a very static manner. These have continuously evolved in response to changing conditions, thereby ensuring sustainability. So just to think that heritage just got created in the past and we are just going to be romanticizing about it, I think this is a wrong notion. Heritage has always evolved. It has always, and the very reason why heritage has survived is that it has kept at pace with time. And that process of evolution has continued to happen over generations. So while we consider the virtues of heritage as a dynamic, evolving knowledge systems, we should not be romanticizing about these. And we should not also be romanticizing about many traditions that are rooted in dogma and prejudice, and that has delivered injustice and violation of human rights. And there needs to be a very rational reflection and evaluation of heritage from every perspective. And this is something which is also important for us to keep in mind. Let's not just be romanticizing about it. Let's be reflective about it. Let's be always critical about it and take from what we have learned over time. So what implication does it have on the way we look at heritage in post-COVID world? Now, this is the question we are all facing now, right? How are we going to get to this new world that we are now kind of imagining it would be like? So first and foremost, we need to think of heritage not only as cultural or natural, but as a product of dynamic interaction between culture, nature, and people. This approach is now being increasingly considered, and I would like to recognize excellent work done in this area by many international organizations. And here I would like to especially mention ICOMOS, IUCN, and ICROM, my present organization, where they have been actually moving ahead in this whole idea, with this whole idea under the initiative of connecting practice. This has further led towards development of place-based approach for heritage management in the existing ICROM IUCN World Heritage Leadership Program. Now, I want to emphasize, what do we mean by heritage place-based approach? We are not talking about a site. We are not talking about a building. We are talking about a place. So let me explain briefly what this place-based approach means. Firstly, it means that rather than recognizing only outstanding values You know, if you look at World Heritage Sites, probably we really try to boast about those OUVs, as we call them. The approach, which is place-based, gives due recognition to all the values that have been relevant to local communities. And when I talk about local communities, let us not put local communities as one homogeneous lot. Communities are diverse. Even within one community, there are diverse communities. And here I would like to mention heritage of weak, marginalized, and minorities as well. So let's not focus only on the heritage that belongs to the majority and the powerful. Let's look at the heritage which belongs to all sections of the community. This is also important because without these larger set of values, they may not be very, you know, these larger set of values may not be so striking, they may not be so evident, but they play much more important role even to sustain these so-called outstanding universal values. Without these larger set of values which have more meaning for the local communities, these special values that we classify as OUV have no meaning, and they will not even hold if the larger sets of values are not there. So these sets of values may transcend the demarcated boundaries of the site. We tend to demarcate, you know, our heritage sites as core area or as buffer area, but these set of values will extend beyond those demarcated boundaries. And this is important for us to recognize. And secondly, besides these intrinsic heritage values, whether we call them architectural, archaeological, social, you know, these are those intrinsic values that we as heritage professionals sometimes really talk about. I think it's also very important that we also try and recognize that heritage benefits people for a sustainable and healthy living through all these knowledge systems, through all these ecosystem services, and of course, economic benefits, which we all know is a double-edged sword, but is also very important. So let's not only celebrate the intrinsic values of heritage, let's also recognize the benefits heritage has for the people, for the society at large, and now with this COVID pandemic, also for the health of people at large, which is very much being shown through the studies that are being done now. So also considering of a place, there's another thing which comes into focus, and that what we have been talking about earlier is about what risks we are facing. What are those kind of disaster risks we are facing? Because those factors that may affect our heritage may lie in the larger territory, but will have very significant bearing on the site. So what I mean to say is that those risks are not only concentrated within your demarcated boundary. The actual reason for the risk might be much further away. So let's take the example of a watershed region that helps in discharge of water. You know, when there are heavy rains, because of this watershed region, water is discharged, you know, and it kind of flows away. But haphazard developments in the region have in fact destroyed the local hydrological system and has eventually led to floods that are affecting our heritage sites. So, you know, we cannot make a risk plan for our heritage sites without looking at the larger territory, because the larger reasons for risks are lying in the larger territory and not just restricted to our little boundary that we may demarcate as heritage. So flood control measures that are only restricted to demarcated or core buffer areas, no matter how expensive, how high-tech they are, will not be so effective if these larger developmental challenges in the territory are not resolved. This, of course, also means that we manage our sites, and not just as management of the sites, but we have to look at the larger governance systems, which are the enabling condition for that management to work. Because what does this governance system help us? It will help us to transcend various jurisdictions, to transcend various legislative frameworks. You know, just to give you an example, disaster risk management, climate change, heritage management, they are all in different ministries and different departments, but they are all so much what kind of governance do we have that enables that interaction? So if we have to really address these issues, we have to also go beyond and look at the way we do our governance. And that's very important also. This also implies that various actors, and now when I say actors, I want to mention that we can look at stakeholders, but we should also look at rights holders. You know, stakeholders may have an interest in the site, but there are people who have right over their site because it belongs to them. Because that is their culture, it is their land. And we have to recognize participation of both the stakeholders and rights holders in the management process. And so we have to ensure that this community participation is not just reduced to mere rhetoric. And that, I think, is a huge challenge we are facing. And I'm going to conclude with this last point that I want to make. And that's like, we are in the age of complex crisis. We can no longer say, you know, we have to make a plan for earthquake, we have to make a plan for flood, we have to make a plan now for pandemics. I think this is a very wrong way of looking at things, because we are facing a situation where there are multiple hazards connecting together. We have disasters, we have conflicts, we have pandemics. Let's not look at them separately. Let's not look at earthquake, flood, fire separately. They all have many connecting causes. The underlying causes are the same. So the need of the hour is that heritage sector gets out of its siloed approach and meaningfully engages with non-heritage actors. This is very important, I feel, because if we as heritage sector are only talking to our own little club and being happy about our own little terminology and patting our backs, I think we are not going to make much headway. We will be always isolated and weak. We have to make ourselves very much there in the wider set of other non-heritage actors and non-heritage sectors, whether they are from development, whether they are from climate change or all the other actors. We have to find ways of communicating better and working out innovative solutions that are for the betterment of humankind. And heritage is a carrier of accumulated wisdom, and that has to be recognized, and that role has to be reinforced. And therefore, at the end, I would just like to make a call for holistic thinking that connects nature to culture, tangible to intangible, and people to their place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jigyasu. You're advocating, and we've all been advocating for a holistic approach, and but also you underlined the importance of a traditional knowledge system and the wisdom. For example, the First Nations or indigenous people across the world who've been warning us about these kinds of disasters. Now, in terms of taking that holistic approach to nature and culture, the Canadians have been doing a very important work. I mean, in fact, the concept of ecomuseology, which is from France, but I think the Canadians are, practitioners on an extensive level. The International Coalition of Cultural Justice. Doug, tell us about it, but also tell us a little bit about the ecomuseology movement that you're involved in. You know, what sort of, Miniya has, and so has Mrs. Rizvi, advocated for the strong role of museums and heritage places. What's Canada doing in this area with ecomuseology, advocating a holistic approach? Over to you, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Amar, and thank you everyone for very stimulating discussions so far. I'm thrilled to be here and part of this. It's very refreshing, and especially to be hearing so many people talking about a holistic approach and museums getting out of comfort zones and really starting to look at our own practice and where we have the potential to shift some of the foundation blocks. And thanks, Amar, for acknowledging the role of Canada. It's interesting when you're living in a place like Canada, I often go looking everywhere else for insights, and certainly from the international community and the work of ICOM, there is just so much that hasn't percolated down to the front lines of museum work in Canada. But there are some lights that shine, and so I want to tell you a little bit about some of my work in Canada as a culture and sustainability specialist for the past 40 plus years with museums, and also my relationship and role in the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice. And thank you to everybody for acknowledging how so many of the issues that are tormenting in many ways the human situation are all linked. I couldn't agree more, and I was going to say some things, but I've crossed those off now because people have covered that territory very well. I would like to suggest, though, that in that light, both our environmental and our social challenges and problems have been caused by the cultures that operate around the world. And by the same token, I would also suggest that it's going to be cultural change, which is where we're going to find solutions and new ways forward. Perhaps this is going to be from shifts in deep values within the living culture. Sometimes it's going to be shifts in societal systems. But whatever the case is, it's not going to be simply a shift inside the museum world. It's going to be how are museums able to help the living culture go through their own shifts and adaptations in a changing world. In this Heritage Matters webinar, there are progressive museums from around the world gathering to share ideas and visions for our cultures and how our museums operate. And I think it's worth remembering, or at least I would suggest that I've come to believe that the ultimate goal of museums is to have positive adaptive impacts on living cultures. And heritage is absolutely vital. And again, many of you have talked about the importance of culture and heritage and bringing forward insights from the past that are not simply the solutions, but those insights do help to be catalysts in creating new insights into solving today's problems. We aren't going to go forward by going backwards, but we do need to keep our history and heritage with us as we move forward. I see museums and heritage organizations in this moment really doing that, adopting the role of catalysts of cultural change and adaptation, aiming to create cultures of regeneration and flourishing for all. And I do think that's a tall order, but it is an exciting one, and it's an amazing challenge. Now I want to talk a little bit about the coalition. The Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice is a network, and therefore it's available to everybody on the planet through that network. It was created in 2016 by Robert Janes and some of his colleagues, and I count myself amongst that circle. But programmatically, it became active in the spring of 2017 through the wonderful work of Christine Castle, who really got the social media strategies up and running, along with a couple of other people. But really, it seemed like Chris was the driving force behind all of that. Now there's a blog, and the blog has 1,200 people following it, with 100 or so articles that have been generated. There's a Facebook group with 670 members and thousands of entries. There's a Twitter account with 1,500 followers. As well, we have developed face-to-face workshops, learning circles, and resources that we have deployed in more localized environments. I've been involved in a number of those in Toronto. Now, I did post in the chat box some links so that you can find connections to these resources. You just need to go looking for it in the chat box. Now, the mission of the coalition is to mobilize and support Canadian museum workers. Now, you can already tell that it started out there, but it's now international. But to mobilize and support museum workers and their organizations to build public awareness of climate change, to actively mitigate climate change and to create resilience in both human and natural systems. So it's an ambitious agenda. Now, what are museums actually doing? Well, from following the discussions happening through the network, you can see that museums are struggling to revisit visions and missions in order to clarify the impacts they hope to have in the larger community, to reassess the skills that they have and those they need in order to achieve the goals and impacts they want to have. Learning how to engage all stakeholders, and I do want to acknowledge this distinction between stakeholders and rights holders. And it is truly important that these processes really are very inclusive. We need to understand the needs and wants of populations, as well as to build relationships through this engagement with stakeholders and rights holders. Using co-creative processes related to visioning, goal setting, and building the adaptive capacity of local cultures. So the coalition social media resources really can be helpful. So I'll just say again to go and check out those links there. Now, as museums embrace the goal of co-creating meaning with stakeholders, some new cultural impact goals have emerged, at least for me, all of which figure in museum planning and assessment. They include, the first one is reflection. To what extent are museums actually able to help stimulate this reflection, personal introspection that's value-based, that's humble, that is embracing truth and honesty? The second is dialogue. And to what extent are museums really involved in processes that are creating dialogue in which listening, empathy, trust, respect, synergy, and cohesion are all developed and nurtured? Creative action, and that is really producing the kind of adaptive change actions that can variously be personal, social, organizational, and systems-based. And the fourth one is meaningful assessment, creating new ways to understand what the needs and opportunities are within communities and to generate feedbacks that, that guide creative processes towards our visions and goals. Now, one tool that I created last year as part of my work with the AASLH in the Sustainability Committee of the board is something I call the inside-outside model, which is museum planning for cultural impact. And it does help, I think, to illustrate how we're looking at the internal resources as well as looking out at the external impacts that need to change in order to address the kinds of challenges that we face. How do we link all these things? So there is a link to that material as well in the chat box. And I think I will leave it there, and we can talk more about eco-museums in Canada when we get to the discussment phase.
Thank you, Doug. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think one of the important things is, Doug, that until COVID-19, there were still large number of climate skeptics. But I think that now the world has come to recognize the cultural dimension of climate change. The kind of debates before, you know, they're a thing of the past. I mean, that's really good. I think it's wonderful. We got, you know, 4 panelists. I'm sorry, there's the technical people are playing around with my camera, so I'm getting distracted. I think that the 4 panelists, one of the important things that you all raised is the importance of civic spaces like museums and heritage places, their role as civic spaces and their educational value in environmental awareness about climate change and climate emergencies. They have a much greater role to play, and Mrs. Rizvi has kickstarted it. And then Miniya has connected this also to the whole question of what in India. I know there are a lot of people internationally from over 80 countries. In India, we call it roti, kapda, or makan. That's what Miniya has done. You know, roti is bread, kapda is cloth, and makan is shelter. those basic things, so we can't be talking about these things in glass houses. And of course, one of the things, as a former vice president of International Council of Museums, have been critical is that roughly about 20% of middle class people connect with museums. There's about 80% that don't in a country like India. And so are we talking about among ourselves? And also Rohit and Doug, sort of you brought together the need for holistic approach and the whole question of living heritage and all that knowledge that we've received from past generations that we're ignoring in the contributing to the deterioration of the climate. There are a whole range of issues that are coming up. Now, I'm trying to, Sharavari is clustering questions for me, and but then Miniya, you're the target for questions. All the questions are coming to you, so we're trying to cluster them. So okay, Dr. Miniya Chatterji, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, in a country like India, this is what it's been summed up as, where everyone is looking for loopholes to save taxes. Let me say that India is not alone here. I'm an Australian. We do the same thing in Australia. How can we engage with corporate social responsibility, and how can government motivate corporates to fund environmental causes?
Yeah.
One question too.
That's a great question, because precisely for the reason that it's so easy to evade taxes as well as evade CSR. I've been on both sides of CSR, being part of large organizations which have a mandate to do CSR, as well as I've run a not-for-profit which has been a recipient of CSR. And what happens is that it's easy to earmark CSR funds for engagements that you would anyways do in the company. You would have anyways maybe spent on environment because of certain compliances, and environment is one of the buckets in which CSR, in India is defined as. So it is for that reason. And then I've seen the opposite, the other side. I'll quickly just narrate an anecdote for that little not-for-profit that I used to run along with my job at the World Economic Forum. So, I was in Nizamabad and I was visiting a small orphanage, and that and it was in fact an orphanage for HIV positive kids. And my heart broke looking at these kids and who were not receiving their medicines. And I asked the person who was running it, why aren't they getting their medicines? And the guy told me that because their medicines were coming from a CSR fund of a company, and the CSR manager changed, and the new manager has a new plan for CSR. So it's it's not sustainable to be funding social causes through CSR. Instead, what we can do is look at organizations, large organizations, small organizations, and have the process of production, the services that they provide, the product range that they have, the way that they are engaging with their customers and their employees. Look at how these organizations can be responsible, ethically, be ethical, be socially responsible, environmentally responsible. Incentivize social good so that when the tap runs dry, like is the case now, CSR and R&D are not the first two things which stop getting the funding. There is what if you incentivize organizations to do good by maybe having a steel company make windmills, there, for example. Or the processes of making steel can be energy efficient, right? So where there is a monetary savings as well. So this is what I do, and there you're making sustainability sustainable. Does that make sense, Amar?
Yeah, it does, Miniya. Thank you so much. You're so lucid in explaining. And let's keep the questions coming. And the next question is, Rohit, yeah, Professor Jigyasu, you mentioned about the multiple ministries and the silos and the need for interdepartmental coordination. You referred to it. So the question that's come is that now this emergency with COVID-19 emergency has brought government departments together in many ways to work together. So do you think this kind of coordination that's been forced upon departments to come together to address the emergency, do you think that this would continue? Do you think some of the blind spots that are there that could be addressed? This is what several people are asking. Because I think it's not only a concern in India, I think it's a concern in many countries from where people have come as participants in this webinar.
Yeah. So as it is said, disasters can sometimes become opportunities. But of course, they will not become opportunities by their own unless a concerted effort is made. So the challenge is that at the moment they are all trying to work together, or they are forced to work together. I'm afraid that if systemic changes are not done, and that's why I was speaking about, you cannot make change unless the enabling systems or your governance is not really, changing in the way it is used to function. Things will unfortunately fall back in the same trap as we had before. So I think what we really need to do is at this moment, when organizations are forced to work together, when ministries are supposed to collaborate, it is the time when we should build a culture where at least you know what the other ministry does, who are the other people who matter in the other organization. The problem is, and I have found it in my own career over several years now, where I started to work with disaster risk management as a heritage professional, I found that heritage people don't know disaster management people. No understanding of what policies exist in that realm, who is the nodal person, who is not even knowing which is the nodal ministry or organization that is responsible. And same the other way around. So the important thing for us is to use this as an opportunity, even within a small, sometimes, we become very pessimistic. How can we make that big change? Yes, it is very difficult for us to make the big leap, but I think the change will come from one person, right? So if we start to at least know people from other organizations, if we have already been forced to build a kind of a coordination in this pandemic, can we kind of start to engage in a dialogue so that we at least are much familiar with what the other organizations does, so that we can take that discussion forward, even at a personal level? I think it will make a lot of change. So I have seen it myself that when I started to work on this, there was hardly anybody from the disaster field working with heritage field, but the situation has changed. It took, of course, 15, 20 years of persistent efforts for things to materialize in the way we want them to materialize. But I think what is important is the change will only come from every single person who is motivated, is conscious, and is ready to kind of work in a certain direction. So there is no magic wand that we will have which will make the quantum leap to the new kind of paradigm we are talking about. But I think it has to be awareness and a consciousness that has to be generated in every single person who is engaged to see it in a long-term perspective. And that's why I've been emphasizing right from the beginning that let's not look at COVID pandemic. I think it is very important for all of us as professionals to make a larger awareness that don't look at it as a single virus problem. It is a problem which is systemic. It is a problem which is much wider, and it is all connected. So if we can even make that consciousness more than what it is right now, I think we will have turned this unimaginable crisis into a kind of an opportunity. And I hope that will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jigyasu. Thank you for answering that question. That actually brings me back to Mrs. Rizvi. Mrs. Rizvi, I've been I'm an old man, been associated with your museum one way or the other for a long time, from the very foundation days. And the way the museum was established was through community engagement across India. Now, the thing is that since I've come back to India after 43 years, one of the things I find everybody says is the government hasn't done this, government hasn't done that, government departments don't work together. I'm scratching my head to find two professional bodies in this country that work together. Every professional body works in a silo, whether they're heritage body or, and NGOs compete with each other, they don't work together. So there are huge issues over here. But how are you dealing with it? Because you have this way of dealing with NGOs, conservation scientists, right across India, and your museum is a distributed network. How do you deal with this?
Dr. Gala, as you know, that this museum is under Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. But then our clients, our target audience are across all over India. And we have realized, not only me, my predecessors also have realized that if we are just working, like you said, in a silo and doing, making the programs and activities and exhibitions on our own, it will not serve the purpose. So we are working with not only with government organizations, like-minded institutions, whether it is ZSI, BSI, and other, and also with civil societies, also a lot of NGOs. So that means, because then it is very important for a museum to, or to do any work which will have an impact or a wider impact on public, it is important that you need to use your resources. And as a government organization, sometimes we do have our limitations in different areas where we can reach. So we are looking forward for NGOs, we are looking forward for other departments. And that is how the activities and the programs of NMNH is being done, whether at headquarters in Delhi or at our regional centers at Bhopal, Mysore, Bhubaneswar, Savai Madhopur. And we will continue the same pattern in our new center that is coming in Gangtok also. So like you said, it is a holistic approach and different for a museum to actually give purpose and give something to society. It cannot work in isolation. So we need experts, we need scientists, and in fact, I have started one thing, that it is not only that if you're a natural history museum, you should work only on natural history subject. We need to open up ourselves and go to other museums also of art, culture. We are exchanging, their, you can say, their ideas, their knowledge, and we are doing programs with them also for, giving benefit to the society.
Thank you, Mrs. Rizvi. Thank you so much. I think you're doing a great job. It's very challenging to do this, but you're providing amazing leadership. Thank you. Now, please, those of you who want to ask questions, there's a question and answer box. Use it there, not in the chat box. I'd really appreciate it, because we have somebody monitoring the question and answer box. Okay, the next question is to you, Miniya. Apparently, they want me to ask you so that you can talk about your work at Ananta. And I personally feel that what you do is exemplary across the world. And so I think it's not just Ananta National University where we both are affiliated, but it's more the whole world. So Miniya, could you share some examples of leveraging innovations through museums and universities where new partnerships for climate change actions have emerged? That's a few people have asked that question. That's over to you, Miniya.
Yeah, thank you, Amar. I think in different countries, the culture for the private sector and the government to partner with universities and research institutions, including museums, is different. Some do it more and some do it lesser, some do it better and some don't do it too well. I think in India, it is relatively new. We've seen this at Anant, where during, your question asked for an example. So here's an example of what we've done. At the Anant Center for Sustainability, a Think, Teach and Do tank, we have been doing quite a lot of research on vacant houses in India. So 7.5% of residential buildings in India are lying vacant. And when the virus hit India, spontaneously we thought about that, why don't we transform all these vacant houses lying around into temporary hospitals? It was about 5 days of furious work and several consultations from, medical practitioners to policy folks, to agencies which set up hospitals. And we came up with a plan which had the exact details of how do you set up and what kind of spaces are required for different stages of coronavirus patients. And also, how do you fund these? We anticipated the government funds to be, not very to be depleted because of tackling the virus. So we came up with PPP solutions so that the government doesn't have to pay out of its pocket. And we submitted this whole plan to the Prime Minister's office. And, we submitted it, but at the same time, I thought that I'll never probably hear back from them. It's gone into one black hole. And so I started contacting their friends, who were in positions who could help. And through that, we found a space in Kerala, and we found a space in Mumbai. These were friends who were in prominent government positions, and the initial two facilities, one was a temporary hospital for 20 beds, and the other in Mumbai was a 100-bed facility for mild patients of coronavirus, so basically quarantining them. And these two are funded by Anant. But what happened was that even while we were setting them up, so we took like 4 days to set these hospitals and quarantine centers up. We got offers from the government to set them up at several other locations in India. And the private sector came in to fund these. One big reason for that was that we were doing it very effectively. Like we were doing it in 3-4 days. We were setting up complete hospitals. But the other big reason was that we were doing, and we were effectively also because we were doing it in spaces and ways that we had studied and researched would be optimal to set these up. But also because there was a lot of frugal innovation which was incorporated, and we were able to do it at the cheapest price ever in the world. So, a lot of the equipment, hospital beds and medicine boxes and cabinets, we designed and manufactured at the university out of laminated corrugated cardboard. So that drastically brought the costs down of setting anything up. All the equipment, medical equipment, we basically looked at what is essential and what is not. Imagine that we're setting up a field hospital during a war. So what is required and what is not. And that's how we're setting these up. Every week, we're actually doing 2 facilities a week. And so far, we've set up 720 beds in all. And as we speak, we have facilities coming up in different places. And this is only possible because of the government coming in to help us do that. Because ultimately, we set them up and then hand them over to the government to run them. And we need permissions from the government to set these up. And the private sector is coming in to fund these. We are now doing one with Tata. We've done one funded by Godrej. We're doing one in the Piramal Group's office. We've done several for BMC, the Municipal Corporation in Mumbai. So that's an example of how government and private sector and universities can collaborate towards very innovative, research-driven solutions which are affordable, which is needed for a country like India to scale up.
Thank you, Miniya. There are a few questions that have come up. I mean, one of the things is that when we talk about heritage, Rohit and Doug also knows this. A lot of people have very, fractured pasts and painful pasts. And when we talk about heritage, and asking people to focus on the heritage, isn't this painful for people? And in fact, on the 4th of July, we got a special webinar on this, dealing with the whole question of marginalization, caste, and racism, sort of addressing this. I'll leave it for the future, that particular question. And then there's, sorry, I'm looking through, what should, like a lot of museums and heritage sites, so the whole question of economic value is coming in, that you have entrance fees, they're not free, especially in India, you have to pay. So how can people be reconnected? So this is a ongoing question that I don't expect it to be discussed over here, but I want you to know it's coming up as an issue. And how can we simplify the language, whether it's heritage or environmental, conservation, climate emergency, that the language gets complicated, audible to middle class people, educated people, but how do we actually communicate? How can we use language that's understood by people rather than, sort of a middle class discourse? So that's another question that's come up. And so now, Mrs. Rizvi and Doug, both of you have got a question here. Ecotourism. How does ecotourism help, to raise awareness, but also help communities both in India and Canada? Over to you. Who wants to go? Mrs. Rizvi, you might want to go first.
Like you said, there was one question of that they should know that it is difficult for people to visit museums. So let me clarify it, that all our centers, regional centers, we don't charge any entrance fees, nor there is any fees or any kind of, money that has to be paid to participate in any program, training, coming to museum, or whatever film shows. So it's completely free of cost. And yes, I do believe that as far as environment is concerned, so maybe there are different problems with different museums, but to somehow there should be some portion, some exhibits in each museum which should be free for people, at least to understand what is environment, why it is important to us, what is happening in the environment, how we as an individual can help in reforming all those things. So at least this is a question which needs to be addressed properly, and it's a very valid question that when we talk about a country like India, and if we are charging too high, but then there are for some specialized museum, otherwise most of the museums in India has either they have got free access, government museums, or it has a very nominal charge. And also, if there are some charges, but for people from not very sound economic background, where the entry is free also. Second thing is, like you said, that the question is that like I earlier said, that museum is a place which can create awareness, whether it is COVID or any pandemic, disaster, environment, heritage, culture, anything. This is a place where everybody comes, they are comfortable to learn, because it says these are all they are non-formal institutions of learning. So all we need is that here is a place in a museum where 100 things can be accommodated and can be addressed and could be understood, especially the literacy part. Like somebody said that somebody has said that there are some terms which has become so difficult. Now popular publications of museum, popular lectures of museum can address all these problems. Simplify the terms, make them understand. We can communicate in local languages, and the material can be converted according to the target audience you are that are coming to your museum. So these are the problems, and still I feel that there is a big opportunity, and it's a sector where there is a lot of potential which can address to these things in a very nice manner. But all we need is that there has to be a holistic approach. Museum cannot work in isolation. So we need to have good links with universities, with other forest departments, with other organizations, with experts like you all over there, and many more. So that way, all these things, at least there can be a step forward in dealing all these problems.
Thank you, Mrs. Rizvi. Thank you for addressing a range of questions that are all tied up together. Doug, do you want to contribute? Yeah.
Yes, I'd just like to say something about the whole business of ecotourism, because there are lots of people who are striving in all kinds of interesting and great ways to try and bring the economic benefits of tourism to regions, particularly with a mindfulness around economic impact or environmental and ecological impacts. One of the big challenges revolves around measurement. How do you measure impacts? And if any of you are involved in the business of looking at carbon impacts, you know that there are 3 different levels of measurement, scope 1, 2, and 3. And most of the time, governments will sort of talk about levels 1 and 2, scope 1 and 2, but they rarely talk about 3. And of course, with any ecotourism, there's just such huge challenges with air travel and the carbon footprint related to that. But I would like to stress, I guess, that in a globalized world, with a globalized, pluralized world, we have to find ways that we are building meaningful connections to people. And part of that is understanding where people have come from. And many people increasingly have diverse, pluralist backgrounds. And so they actually come from many places in the world. And it's necessary for people to know those places and to connect in meaningful ways. It's where I think museums that see themselves as destinations may need to think more broadly about what impacts they're actually trying to have, and go about that in a more systematic way. So much can be done in terms of building those kinds of relationships within pluralist environments, even locally. And I think museums haven't yet figured out exactly how they can do that.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much. On that particular note, I just want to add something. In 2001 or 2002, I can't remember, I'm getting old, that it was UN International Year of Mountains and Ecotourism. There was huge protest in the UN General Assembly from many countries of the South, that in many countries of the South, at that particular time, the issue was South Africa, that the infrastructure for ecotourism was owned by the haves, the rich people. So in fact, a lot of community groups, especially indigenous people, travel communities, felt that in the name of ecotourism, people who have access to infrastructure, resources, they're actually exploiting them. So Kofi Annan was the UN Secretary General, so he had ecotourism taken off from the UN year. It was UN year for mountains and ecotourism, he had it taken off as a result of the protest. I'm not saying it's all bad. I mean, I've seen wonderful examples of ecotourism. In Australia, for example, Aboriginal people who own the infrastructure, who do benefit analysis, ensure that they are the primary stakeholders, the rights holders, to make that clear, as Rohit has asked us to do. And but there are also exploitative situations in the world. So I think ecotourism is something that we need to really, not only the carbon footprint, but also the exploitative nature of it in many parts of the world that indigenous people point out, we have to think about it. Now, getting back to one of the questions that's come up, we talk about sustainability. I mean, it doesn't matter, we say cultural sustainability, environmental, economic, social sustainability. We say all these things, but we always talk about it in terms of economic development. And while we've depleted, the question is, while we've depleted so many of the natural resources, how is the sustainability going to work for the poor in India? Is the concept of sustainability feasible for the rural areas in India? I think Miniya has just come back. Miniya, you heard the question, right? Could you?
Yeah, I'm right here. I think my video was a bit patchy there.
Could you address the question, please? You want me to repeat the question, no?
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
So sustainability, it's not just about your natural resources or climate change. It is, in fact, about making sure that several stakeholders are benefiting from a growth or the resources, the limited resources that we have. So from that perspective, I think the question is very relevant, that how do we make sure that the natural resources that we have, the population which is at the bottom of the pyramid, they are also benefiting from that or not. That brings me to, again, the point that I made earlier, that the organizations which are, which are mining, which are, natural resource driven organizations, they need to be responsible. They need to not do this for, CSR purposes, but they need to actually feel the responsibility that the communities, the tribals, who are placed around these areas, and usually these communities are impoverished, those communities are taken care of. Now, that taken care of is very debatable, because what happens is that, these organizations, they feel that taken care of would mean educating them in schools, in giving them specific facilities that they think is modernization. And that is what the problem is, because these communities, these are the natives, of those areas, and they are usually, not well off, and they need to be asked, they need to be involved in the process of what, this is what we're trying to do in the area. How do we want to go about doing this? It is a long drawn approach, and I'm not being idealistic here. This is the way that some of the best companies in the world develop areas. But that development, I think what's important is that the best of the companies, they know that what they consider development is not what the bottom of the pyramid and the people, the communities living around would consider development. So, now, I've just parked that argument there of inclusivity of those communities in decisions around sharing of resources. And I would just highlight one thing, that the need for education is really key in making sure that when these communities are asked and are involved in these decisions about their future, would they be able to make the right decisions or not? And I'm not talking about education which is linked to literacy, ABCD, or, but education which empowers these people to make the right choices, to know what their choices are and to make the right choices.
Thank you, Miniya. You're so eloquent in the way you explain things. I don't think you're being idealistic in saying that there's one country that I know, and Doug knows quite well, and Rohit has been there several times, so that's Vietnam, where,
Yes.
people are empowered, fishing communities, for example, in Halong Bay. So if you go to their schools, their curricula is actually co-created, co-planned with the primary stakeholders, the rights holders. So Vietnam does this really well. I'm not saying many countries do this well, but Vietnam certainly does well. And guess what? If you look at the statistics of COVID-19, where is it almost invisible, non-existent? It's Vietnam. That respect for environment, working together, that whole approach that's there. Now, thank you, Miniya, once again. And Rohit, you want to say something?
I just wanted to continue with the very interesting thread which Miniya started and you kind of carried on, because I think the important thing for us to consider is that different people look at their natural resources in a very different way. Land is not a commodity to be sold for everyone. For some people, land has much more meaning than just a commodity to be sold and to be bought. And when you reduce everything to one common denominator, you end up with problems. So I think an important thing for us to keep in mind, and I think this is to be reinforced, is that why we have a lot of land still remaining as forested land is not because there was some environmental law. It was because the communities decided to keep that as a collective thing, as an asset for them, So I think that kind of a recognition of what a nature, environment, and resources mean for you has to be brought forward and not just all subsumed in this one common definition that under
Well,
neoliberal paradigm.
well said, Rohit. Well said. In fact, if you look at the UN Working Group on the Rights of Indigenous People that worked on drafting the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as preparatory documentation, Sir Martinez Cobo did a global mapping of indigenous people's idea of land. And then he came up with one line, which is now very popular. That is, everywhere people own land, but indigenous people, they belong to the land. I mean, that's the fundamental thing. It was a nine-volume documentation from across the world. And I think that, thank you, Rohit, for bringing us back to some very basic ethics, of engagement. Now, one last question that I'd like to share before I ask all of you very briefly to say, a concluding remark. And this one is addressed to Rohit. Talking about, living heritage of people, with COVID-19, the pandemic, its impact on hereditary communities and who are involved in hereditary, occupations like crafts and so on. What do you see? I mean, what is the post-COVID scenario where these people are already highly impoverished and the intergenerational transmission has been, disrupted seriously?
It's a huge problem. Actually, the problem at the moment, I would suggest, I would really say is that the marginalized are becoming more marginalized. And when we think about craftsmen and artisans, especially those who are living in cities, they are all really being impacted much more. Like all small businesses, they are impacted much more than the others. They don't have raw materials. They are no longer even having people. They already had less customers, and they are no longer having even those. So I think the problem is that when you brand everything under one common, like we call them either migrant crisis, and you are bundling everyone together as one, right? But in that process, you are not recognizing that there are different sets of people who are impacted differently, and you have to tailor your support in a very targeted way. You cannot put them all under one umbrella and then say, like, we treat them all as those who have to be as small and medium scale enterprises, or whatever. I think there is a problem there. And as you rightly said, there have to be specific policies to support these artisans, because already they have very few, people are not carrying forward their skills. They don't have enough market, and this has become even more. So I would suggest that why don't we use the digital medium? Why don't we use the new information technology to help these artisans market their products? I'm sure there are some efforts being done, but my problem is that a lot of those are being done by those who are educated, who have access to technology. But there are very few who are becoming like intermediaries between these artisans who are not educated and the larger market where their products can find their customers. So I think we also need to be like bridge between them and enable the technology to kind of benefit them, because there is a potential there now with COVID-19 and people not being there. But I think there are very few initiatives that are targeting them. And I think that's something very much important.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you very much. I just want to point out that, I'm of Indian descent and I live in India, but I'm an Australian. And one of the ways we are dealing with in Australia is we have resilient funds that have been established, and where Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders who are highly disadvantaged already within the economic system are affected by COVID-19. These resilience funds are helping people with all kinds of support mechanisms through actual cash as well as in-kind support. I think this is something that, Germany is looking at, and there are different countries that are looking at resilience funds. And when we think about resilience funds, it shouldn't be just about deficit model, but it should be very affirmative in the way we build up people and communities. Now, there are a few other questions coming we can't address all of them, but we will take them on board. The question again comes up, yes, all this is being recorded, it'll be uploaded. In fact, we have over 620 registrations, and the panelists can see on average we are hovering around 140 to 150. We went up to 190 plus, people who actually engaged. But others, when they wake up, they listen. And one of our previous webinars was accessed by over 7,000 people. So yes, we're very conscious about uploading them. And one other thing that I want to answer, because the same three people, because I go on a lot of webinars internationally, but the same three people from India ask the same question every webinar we have with Heritage Matters. And every webinar in India, sir, is there a certificate for logging in? I'm sorry, there's no certificate for logging in. Don't ask that question because they keep on asking, on every webinar. I hope you get the idea that Anand National University, when we established Heritage Matters and other webinars, the line we took is webinars or seminars on the web. And universities are, intellectual agencies, and we need to engage with contemporary realities, emergencies, and crises. That's the approach we've taken. Now, each one of the panelists, as brief as you can, something that you want to say, because we want to go away positive. We want to fight all this together. We're in this together. Come on. Mrs. Rizvi, how about you start? Could you?
You need to unmute yourself,
Unmute,
Mrs.
yeah.
Rizvi.
Am I audible now? Am I
Yes.
audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I was saying that though the situation is not very good or in and around the globe, with pandemics, with so many, with recession, with jobs going, this and that, but like one of the panelists said that we need to always see an opportunity in that. And in what I feel that whatever is our field, whatever we can practically do, whatever resources we have, how we can help. For example, at my museum, we have decided in all our regional centers that when we will open with one exhibition, which at least can create awareness. Because if you see COVID-19, no vaccine, no, as such, no, medication, all that will help is the information, the awareness. So I can always say with that, in every problem there is an opportunity, and let us all work together, be optimistic and be safe, and let's hope that we get rid of this and we overcome this problem also. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you,
best wishes
Mrs.
to all of
Rizvi.
you.
Thank you. Miniya, do you want to go next? Unmute, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think I would just, since you mentioned there are lots of people watching this, so leverage that opportunity to, make a plea to everybody around to be thinking about not just the immediate issues, but also the more important ones, which might not have a immediacy to them, but then they are important. To not just pander to the more, near-term challenges, but to also look at the mid to long-term ones as well. And I think that would help us a lot, be it looking at new viruses which are attacking, humankind, or whether, climate-related disasters which are awaiting us too.
Thank you, Miniya. Rohit.
I think other panelists have really made very good points. So I'm not going to add, but just reinforce the fact which Miniya also said, that let's not see this as just a pandemic. Let's see this as a lesson for us to really do something which can reduce risk for the future disasters, because this is for us the only chance when we are going through all this, because human memory is very short, you know. Once we are over with it, we'll forget about it. So all that we can do now will have a long-term impact. So we should not wait for things to get better and then we will try. And this is the time for us to make people aware, to make the change, because this is when things are very fresh in the mind. That's unfortunately human behavior. So we have to work with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you. Doug?
Yes, well, I'd like to just go back to something that Mrs. Rizvi said earlier about the importance of museums getting outside their comfort zones. And I think people are doing that, and they're using experimentation to try and test new ways of engaging communities in change-oriented processes. And but I think some of the ones that are our biggest problems are going to be in our economic systems. But there are ways that museums can help to demonstrate how we have to shift from a profit-based economy to a value-based economy that has values on social, environmental, and economic fronts. And this is all new territory, but through experimentation and our own self-reflectiveness, I think museums can expand their role in very important ways. So I'm very excited about that.
Thank you, Doug. And as Miniya said, you know, reacting in the short term is one thing, but being proactive in the long term is what is really needed. And that's what sustainability is all about. And interestingly, in some of the previous webinars, what's come up is, which is relevant for tomorrow, is the World Environment Day, and the theme is on, you know, reducing pollution. You know, it's climate control, but also reducing pollution. And we've seen many images, many stories about how people can actually see the Himalayas in some of the towns in India for the first time. And how clear the skies of Delhi are for a change, or Mumbai for that matter. So in previous webinars, people have actually suggested, you know, can this be taken forward? And India, like maybe other countries too, once a month, once a fortnight, say no traffic, maybe a lockdown, you know, to, you know, try to do something, make a small difference. So this has been a fantastic panel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you. Mrs. Rizvi, thank you for taking the time out. I wasn't sure whether you just flew in or you're flying out, but I really, really appreciate your words of wisdom and your leadership for India. Miniya, eloquent, getting the message across, you're a champion. We need your generation. We are looking up to your generation, the next generation. My generation, I think, stuffed up things very badly, so I'm sorry about that, but I think your generation, we are there to work with you. Rohit, it's the same goes for you, and amazing. You belong to the same generation as Miniya. Thank you for your leadership. Doug, we can just be the old sages there, say whatever mistakes we learned something. Thank you for joining us, waking up early in the morning in Toronto. To all the panelists and the listeners, I really appreciate it. All this is being uploaded. The next webinar is on the 20th, Saturday, 20th of June. It's on museums, but it's to do with COVID-19. And based on major reports from around the world that we're analyzing. And we got the Director of Culture from UNESCO, like that, different people who are actually, you know, from the Director General Emeritus of National Museums of Kenya, so people joining us from around the world. But once again, all the panelists, thank you. All the participants, you've been fantastic staying on. Thank you very much.